Persia was a brilliant civilization that contributed to the progress of mankind, as seen in more enlightened laws, women's rights, irrigation systems, and new religions. What Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great built would be brought down by an equally great conqueror, the Macedonian Alexander the Great. Alexander was a great admirer of Cyrus. Reading from an early age Xenophon's Cyropedia, one key aspect Alexander took from Cyrus's biography was his heroism in battle. Alexander was the king of Macedonia, a kingdom at the northern fringes of the Greek world. He was born in 356 BC and tutored personally by Aristotle. Yes, the Aristotle, the father of Western philosophy. Alexander was already commanding an army and ruling in his father's absence at 16 years old. And then he became king at only 20 years old. His father, Philip of Macedon, had united under one banner the Greek cities Illyria, the modern-day Balkans, and Thrace, modern-day Bulgaria and eastern Greece. Philip was assassinated in 336 BC by the captain of his bodyguard, similar of the fate of Xerxes more than a century earlier. The beginning of Alexander's rule showed he could be ruthless. He had one of his cousins and two Macedonian princes executed. Whether they were responsible for the assassination of Philip or not is unsure. What is sure is that it made his position in the throne very secure. Alexander would also brutally put down any rebellion tentatively following the death of his father. It culminated when he made an example of Thebes, destroying the 1,000-year-old city in 335 BC and selling all of its citizens into slavery, sparing only pro-Macedonians and priests. Maybe out of genuine guilt or to appease his critics, Alexander would later on always show great generosity and favor to any surviving Theban he would meet in person. In any case, it worked at crushing any rebellious ideas in other Greek cities, including Athens. Alexander would follow by imitating Philip and taking the title of hegemon, or supreme commander. In these early moments of his reign, Alexander would display a real military genius. He would stay undefeated in battle all his life, making him one of the greatest generals in history. Alexander invaded the Persian Empire in 334 BC with around 50,000 men, 6,000 cavalry, and a fleet of 38,000 men. He would conquer the western part of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, which was populated by Greeks but living under Persian rule, and then move on to Syria and the Levant. The Greco-Macedonian army met the much more numerous Persian army, at least twice bigger, at the Battle of Issus. The Persians were led by Darius III, and he had cut the Greeks from the conquered territories. A big part of the legend of Alexander has been enhanced by the sheer ineptitude and cowardice of Darius III. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, the Persians attacked the Greeks in a narrow space between the sea and mountain, blocking them from making use of their larger number. When the Persian army started to break under a Greek assault led by Alexander, Darius is said to have been the first one to flee. The view of the Persian emperor running for his life, instead of rallying his troops, led to the Persian army collapsing. This was the first time ever that a Persian army under the command of a Persian emperor would be defeated. One can imagine the shock it must have been to everybody, even Alexander himself. Darius left behind his wife, his two daughters, and even his mother, as well as symbols of his authority like his bow, chariot, and royal mantle. The female relative of Darius would be treated well, but Alexander would refuse to give up on his hostages, except for Darius recognizing him as the Emperor of Persia. Later on, Alexander would marry one of Darius's daughters in order to reinforce his claims on the throne. Alexander would go on to put siege to the Phoenician Tyre, now modern-day Lebanon. To punish it for its resistance, he would destroy the city in 332 BC, kill the men, and sell the women and children into slavery. Gazo would then resist as well, and even seriously wound Alexander in the shoulder, The city would then suffer the same fate as Tyre. After that, the whole of Egypt surrendered quickly. Many cities named Alexandria would be founded in the wake of the conquest, but the Egyptian Alexandria would go on from its foundation in 331 BC and become a major trade center and place of learning, harboring the lighthouse of Alexandria as well as the Great Library. 2 years after the Battle of Issus, Darius would flee again at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. This was despite once again commanding a larger army, fighting on a favorable terrain this time, and having competent and experienced soldiers and commanders. He apparently again fled first, way before any clear winner of the battle could be decided. From there, the Persian Empire would never recover. The rest of Persia fell right after, with Darius unable to successfully raise a full third army. The fate of the previous two must have made volunteers quite rare. In addition, the benevolence of Alexander to places that surrendered made it an attractive option at this point, and his brutality against Tyre and Gaza made it a bad bet to resist too hard as well. Alexander's military genius should not be dismissed, as he showed real prowess in his campaigns to keep control over his vassals since he was 16 years old. His ability to wield both diplomacy and horrific brutality also contributed to his lightning-quick conquest of the largest empire in the world. But a part of his astonishing success also stemmed from Darius's cowardice. Not once but twice did he single-handedly cause the rout of a Persian army twice the size of the Greeks by leading the way to safety. Quite the contrast with Alexander, which would constantly refuse the advice of his generals and lead the battle from the front line. This extreme level of risk taken by Alexander also had a huge impact. Both the Greek and Persian armies were an assembly of soldiers from very diverse and not always very loyal vassal states. When the Greek soldiers fought with Alexander, they didn't fight for the glory of Macedon, a state and culture many of them actively disliked. They fought for Alexander himself, who they had come to admire at a personal level for his courage. And in reverse, when the soldiers from Egypt or Babylon saw Darius fleeing, they hadn't much interest in fighting and risking their lives for a cowardly emperor. Many historians have tried to justify the fall of the Persian Empire as something almost inevitable. They describe the Persian Empire as divided, tired, and declining. But this can be contested. The Persian Empire managed not once but twice to gather an army twice the size of the Greek army. It was not weakened by the previous rebellions or civil wars. There was very little defection by local rulers to Alexander. Overall, the Persian Empire seems to have been still a very functional, well-administrated empire. The Persian Empire might have fallen solely because of the extraordinarily unlucky combination resulting from the clash between two very different men. Darius III, a poor excuse of an emperor, and Alexander, a once-in-a-millennium military genius. By conquering the Persian Empire and uniting it with Greece and Macedon, Alexander had created the largest empire ever seen. The end of the campaign would see the Greek pillaging Persepolis for several days in 330 BC. A fire, intentional or not, started in the palace and burned down most of the imperial capital. It could have been revenge for the burning of Acropolis by Xerxes, or just an accident. Apparently Alexander regretted it, but it was already too late to stop the fire. The relationship of the Greeks with the Persians was a strange one, a bitter rivalry and centuries of war, but also mutual respect, each recognizing the other as civilized in a way, something the Greeks did not extend to many other people. Plutarch tells us that Alexander paused by looking at a statue of Xerxes and asked the statue, "Shall I pass by and leave you lying there because of the expeditions you led against Greece? Or shall I set you up again because of your magnanimity and your virtues in other respects?" Alexander would end up hunting pretenders to the succession of Darius III all over Central Asia, in modern-day Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. Seemingly always restless, Alexander would decide to try and invade India next in 326 BC. The first battles were successful, but this would be one step too far. The men were at this point tired of war and wanted to go home and profit from the spoils of victory. Ultimately, the soldiers faithful to Alexander were in open revolt. They would still obey him and defend him, but conquer no more. Alexander would be back in the old Elamite city of Susa in 324 BC. During the campaign, Alexander started to try to build his legitimacy as a Persian emperor in the eyes of his new subjects. This led to tensions between his Greek troops and him. One remarkable example is when Alexander, drunk, would end up killing a friend that had saved his life previously. The deadly fight started over accusations that Alexander had become corrupted by an Oriental lifestyle. Another issue was how to integrate the Greek and Macedonian veteran with the Persian officers. The initial mixing of command helped, giving Persian troops to Greek officers and the other way around. He also notably tried a wave of mass marriages between his officers and noble women of Susa, the now Persian Old Elamite capital. This would not have durable effects. When finally settling back, he started to put in order to the administration, including executing several satraps that had proven themselves corrupt or disloyal. Shortly after he came back to Persia, Alexander died suddenly in 323 BC. The likely cause was a fever caught in a nearby swamp. But of course, previous attempts and his position led to speculation about poisoning. There are dozens of theories about his death, none conclusive. Some would find it somewhat poetic that a man able to bring down an empire and survive countless battles and injuries would not fall from intrigue, but an ordinary and unglorious cause, like a disease. He would be buried in Alexandria, but what happens to his remains is unclear past the 2nd century AD. Conquest of Persia by Alexander would have lasting consequences. When Alexander was on his deathbed, his generals pushed him to name who the throne should be granted. He would have responded, "To the strongest." This led to the fracture of the empire in four: Macedon and Greece, Thrace in the west of Anatolia, Persia proper with Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and Egypt, which also ruled over part of the Levant, Cyprus, and South Anatolia. The fragments of Alexander's empire would stay under Greek control or influence for most of the next 3 centuries. This period is referred to as the Hellenistic period. The local population would actually not see their life changed by much. It was mostly the aristocracy that changed into fully Greek, or a mix of Greek and Persian or local culture. A good example is the Ptolemy dynasty. Started by General Ptolemy, they would rule uninterrupted until Roman times, basing their power and military recruitment on Greek colonists, but also adopting local customs. The last member of this dynasty would be Cleopatra, the lover of Julius Caesar, ending the Ptolemaic rule with her death in 30 BC. This Hellenization would later see the rise of a Greek empire in Central Asia, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, which ironically would be the last surviving kingdom directly and culturally related to Alexander's conquest. So far from Greece, the Persian Empire soon turned into the Seleucid Empire, named after Alexander's general Seleucus. The Seleucid would be in a bitter rivalry with Ptolemaic Egypt. It would fail to hold on to the territory west of the Indus River and settle it as a natural border with the Indian Maurya people. The Seleucid would try to expand westward into Greece, but would be defeated by the Greeks and their Roman allies. This would weaken the empire and open it later to conquest by the Parthians. The Seleucid would turn out unable to hold on to their empire, with their most lasting legacy being the Hellenization of the region. That same process, pushed by a stream of an immigrant from Greece, would ultimately weaken the empire, with notably the Jewish population successfully rebelling. By the time of Christ, the Greek language would be used for language of learning, trade, and culture. The first Bible would be written in Greek as well. In the Near East and Iran, the Greek influence would slowly fade away. with a progressive return towards Iranian and Zoroastrian ideas. The Bactrians in Central Asia would turn out to be the last standing Hellenic kingdom, with a culture mixing Greek heritage and Buddhism, also called Greco-Buddhism. It is from this region that Buddhism spread toward China. The Parthians were an Iranic nomadic people, living in modern-day Turkmenistan, not unlike the Medes and Persian before them. They were ruled by the Seleucid through Greek satraps until they rebelled and took over the empire. The one to accomplish that was Mithridates I the Great. He started wars in the east to control the Greco-Bactrians in 155 BC, and then occupied the Indus Valley and wars in the west to try to expand into Greco-Roman territory. This follows a now familiar pattern in Persian history. First, there are some natural geographic features. A center of power always based around modern-day Iran, and trying to expand east towards central and India, and west towards the Levant and Anatolia. Competent emperors manage to expand, bad ones see the empire contracting. When a dynasty really weakens, it gets replaced by nomadic invaders. First the Medes, then the Persians, and then the Parthians. For each nomad invasion, the pre-existing bureaucracy and lifestyle mostly stay unchanged, except maybe for the elite. The Parthian Empire was no exception. It is during this period that a full synthesis of Greek and Iranian culture would occur, and one good example of it is the cult of Mithra. Later on, Mithra would be a strong inspiration for the cult of Mithras by Roman legionaries. This cult would be competing with Christianity as a possible successor to the traditional Roman pagan gods. It was inspired by Mithra, but also incorporated a lot of other influences, including beliefs in astrology and divination. It was also a sort of secret society inside the Roman army, with multiple levels of initiation and secret hierarchy, a sort of martial Freemasonry. Going back to the Parthians, a unique feature of the Parthians was a ruling system that was a lot less autocratic. It was aristocratic, in the sense that only the elite had a say in the ruling of the country, but the nobility could decide to depose an unfit king by a vote, without the empire devolving into a civil war. Alternatively, even powerful nobles could be demoted or arrested by the king without troubles, as long as the decision was deemed fair enough. This gave Parthia a high level of political stability, something of an advantage against the always divided Greeks and the Romans, experiencing regular and devastating civil wars. Parthia would be a bitter rival to Rome, constantly blocking its expansion eastward. Parthian mounted archers would be a new core for the Persian Empire army, keeping alive the steppes tradition more than the previous nomadic invaders. Their most memorable tactic was the Parthian shot, a backward arrow fired at the pursuing enemy cavalry. In one especially remarkable military campaign, the Parthians would be responsible for the defeat and killing of Crassus, the third member of the triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey. They killed him in 53 BC by making him swallow melted gold in punishment for his legendary greed. The Sasanian Empire would be the last pagan, as in not Muslim, iteration of the Persian Empire. The best way to look at the Sasanian replacing the Parthian is by looking at the origin of the founders of the dynasty and their ideology. They were from an old Persian noble family, from the same region that Cyrus the Great came from. The empire they built from 224 AD would put back Iranian culture at the center of Persia, with Zoroastrianism turned into a state religion. Hellenization would partially stay, but be much weaker in Iran than in the fringes of the empire, like in the Near East neighbors such as Lebanon and Israel. Other religions would be tolerated, but this characteristic would be essential in distinguishing this new Persian Empire from the Roman Empire, now turning into a Christian empire. Later on, the Sasanian would be the most dangerous and threatening rival to the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire. It is during the Sasanian Empire that the Jewish Babylonian Talmud would be composed. as the empire harbored several Jewish centers of learning. The Sasanians saw the rise of Manichaeism, created by the prophet Mani. It was a religion claiming to be the final revelation, synthesizing the teaching of Zoroaster, Jesus, and Buddha. As a result, it angered the hierarchies of all the main religions of the time. Manichaeism would spread quickly, even if repressed by the Sasanian Empire's leadership, but would be ultimately crushed by the various governments in the West, China, and the Caliphates, and disappear completely by the 14th century. It would nevertheless be very influential on many Gnostic branches of Christianity like the Cathars. The Sasanian Empire would also be a lot more centralized and urbanized compared to the Parthian culture, more influenced by nomadic lifestyles. The Sasanian Empire would develop relations with the East further than the previous Persian Empire. Since the Bronze Age, trade with India and China had created a prosperous trade network, the Silk Road. It took its name from the invention of silk by the Chinese in the 4th millennium BC, and the beginning of its trade out of China from the time of the Persian Empire. The Sasanian and Chinese would also exchange artists, like musicians and dancers, and they cooperated in defending the Silk Road from the ever-present threat of nomadic pillagers from the center of Eurasia. They would also take over the trade with the Indian Ocean, kicking out the Romans from it. The Sasanian Empire is often described as the height of classical Persian culture, and a lot of their philosophy, architecture style, literature, and engineering would later be considered Muslim by foreigners, as the Sasanian style would be exported to the whole Muslim world.